Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. The patch preview that was teased a few weeks ago is now officially live, and aside from all the changes that we knew were coming, it turns out to also include a surprise major overhaul for pathfinding. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. I'm sick of the state of melee pathing, or maybe I just have a cold. But either way, any improvement to melee pathing in AoE 2 is a welcome change, and this patch is actually pretty substantial in that regard. They start by giving a long explanation about how difficult pathfinding is to fix, but that they're working on it, and feel like they made a bit of a breakthrough. One thing I like is the inclusion of a lineup of short videos showcasing a before and after of various pathfinding bugs to give some proof that substantial changes are happening. Even just the fact that gives specific examples you can test for yourself is nice to see what's on their radar and what to watch out for. For one example, if you had a unit isolated from a group and tasked all of the units forward, previously any isolated units would try to regroup first, which meant a unit in front might be going the opposite way you wanted them to for the first few seconds. On the new patch, all of the units will actually move toward what you task them and regroup at the end, so it'll feel like units are actually going in the direction you want them to more often. This also used to be a problem when attacking units if you had one scout a bit closer, for example, and they might initially run away from the target and try to regroup first. Whereas now, they'll seemingly prioritize the attack order first and foremost, which is clearly what you want from a group of scouts if you're raiding. Another example they show that feels like a massive improvement is you may have noticed with groups of archers, when you tell them to go one way, they'll sometimes walk the opposite way first. At least in the example they show on the new patch with similar obstructions, the units seem to be only walking in the direction you tell them to, which feels like a large buff for archer units. Though, as we'll see, this is overall a tough patch for archers for a different reason. The point is, there are lots of these videos showing specific behaviors that should be better this patch, though of course whether these changes introduce their own new set of bugs is something we'll have to see. I've already seen in a comment that at least right after the new patch dropped, female Polish villagers specifically don't get their gold generation from stone bonus, though male Pole villagers do, which is extra odd given it was their full work that was changed this patch and not their minors, but at least the pathfinding changes do seem to be getting us off on the right foot. For me, the most important aspect, though, is how this new pathfinding is changing the dynamic between melee and ranged units, by making melee units much more effective at chasing down groups of fleeing enemies. There's already a perception on the forums it's having a very positive effect for cavalry this patch, but I really want to try to quantify it with some before and after controlled testing, and then really zoom in and look at what the units are doing differently now than they were before. Going into this, there's almost a perception that cavalry couldn't countermass crossbows, not because the crossbow line is inherently overpowered, especially now that they've had their upgrade costs nerfed, but that pathfinding made cavalry just bump into each other and overall too inefficient at engaging. Just to very quickly address something I've seen suggested, note that collision size is not changing for melee units. Here's the knight's collision size data on the old patch versus the new one, and they're exactly the same. And while that would be a simple way to make units bump into each other less and slide around each other better, to be clear, any improvement we see is because the units are behaving better. It's not just they made their hitboxes smaller or anything like that. However, they say they're preventing units from bumping as much when chasing things down in the patch notes is something more substantial than units just phasing through each other. Now though, to really dig into the new pathfinding and see if it's truly something for archer civs to worry about, I set up a test with 25 crossbows that I control against 13 knights, roughly balancing total resources, but then the AI turned off and the knights just attack moving, meaning they'll move as if there's no extra micro going on. I will admit you could probably improve on the knight's performance from what I show if you use some split micro dancing with the knights and try to surround the crossbows, but I'm mostly interested in knights that are just attack moved as a simple and common situation. I did 15 trials on the previous patch and the new patch, recording the difference in final HP at the end. So crossbows winning with 20% of their HP left over is plus 20, and knights winning with 20% HP left over is minus 20. I will acknowledge there's a lot of variability when doing this. Just on the old patch, I had everything from 38% of the crossbow HP left over, compared to other trials where the knights actually beat me. Part of that is human inconsistency, but I think a bigger piece is just how random pathfinding is. Some runs were completely magical, is the only way I can describe it, and any damaged knights consistently stayed near the front, where just using stop micro, I would almost unintentionally focus them down one or two at a time in a very efficient way, while other trials damaged knights would just randomly be bumped into the back, and I'd have to keep fighting fresh units over and over in the front rows, and that really felt like it had more to do with wins and losses than anything else. At the end of the day though, here's the results of the 15 trials on the old patch, and then 15 on the new patch with all the pathfinding improvements. If we scatterplot the trials, it looks like a bit of a mess, but we can sort them from best to worst result on the old patch in blue and the new patch in orange, and we can see things certainly look worse for the crossbows on the new patch. The short of it is with the same balance setup with micro, I went from outright winning 9 of the 15 attempts with crossbows to only 2, and my average dropped from 11% of the crossbow HP left to 10% for the knights. So the new patch has actually flipped which side was slightly favored, at least with my level of stop micro. Just because I used to be a math teacher, I'm professionally obligated to push a little further with this and test for statistical significance. We could use an independent samples t-test, for example, which gives us a p-value of 0.001, which for you math nerds know is a very significant result. That said, the new patch gave quite a bit more consistent results, so the variances weren't equal, meaning Welch's t-test is probably more appropriate and gives a very similar conclusion. To be perhaps overly technical, t-tests assume normally distributed data, and I'm not sure we can safely assume that here. So we could instead use the Mann-Whitney U-test, which still tells us it's a very significant result anyway. And the takeaway of all this nerding out is there's something quantifiable going on for melee pathing this patch. The interesting question though is what exactly are the knights doing better now than they were before? I actually think it's easiest to demonstrate if we just have some no attack stance crossbows. This is on the old patch, and notice we do get some extra jostling and knights going all over the place, but even more important if you watch closely is the knights used to just randomly freeze before attacking a new unit pretty consistently. It's only a split second, but I actually think that's arguably the biggest issue that melee units had, and the patch notes say they did specifically address this. In this case, it took 19 seconds on the old patch once the knights reached the first crossbow to clear out the entire group. While doing the exact same test on the new patch, they did the same thing consistently 3 seconds faster. And while less bumping could be helping out, it's actually kind of hard to tell. That freezing aspect happens noticeably less often. Unfortunately, it does still happen now and then, but seems to be shorter and doesn't happen quite as often. Just those 3 seconds shaved off in this test is actually a 19% improvement in the knight's effectiveness, so these are very small things adding up to big differences in melee results. Forgotten Empires actually have a video explicitly addressing this freezing, and I think low-key has been contributing as much as pathfinding when it comes to melee unit issues. This is actually pretty notable for balance, and as a group, cavalry civs were really dominant in the top 10 on the ladder for years. But looking at the top 15 civs across all maps, or just Arabia in the previous patch, I wouldn't say it's overflowing with cavalry, and particularly not specialized knight civs. Obviously, infantry being more viable these days and taking up a number of those spots is a contributing factor, and infantry are very well represented in the higher tiers. But mass archers could also very well not be the counter to heavy cavalry going forward that they were. I should also point out this is bigger than just crossbows versus knights, with the dynamic between archers and scouts being impacted in feudal, now more in favor of scouts, and the fact I think freezing was part of the issue means even step lancers, whose extra reach theoretically always made them somewhat more resistant to pathfinding issues, also benefit from the patch, and I can just say subjectively are tougher to deal with using archers or anything else. I could really see Franks or Mongols sliding back into the top 10 on Arabia just from taking better fights with their mass cavalry. Worth noting is that in theory, groups of archers are also supposed to be a little smarter on this patch than they were before in terms of regrouping, and the same could be said for cavalry archers, but at least from playing around with it myself, for whatever archers seem to be gaining in better pathfinding this patch, it feels like cavalry are benefiting significantly more, and maybe a more effective counter to archers going forward with balanced resources, as they were probably intended. Give it a try yourself though, and see how melee pathing feels. So far, it feels like a step in the right direction to me at least, particularly for a patch that wasn't really sold as being a big one for pathfinding, and already had a number of good balance changes. Even more than pathfinding though, I think this will be remembered as the patch that made town center shooting at boar much safer to do, and I have a separate video covering all the other major changes this patch introduced. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.